You work so hard on your author business, the last thing you want is for the IRS to come in and say that this is not a business, it's actually a hobby. But why would that be so bad? What happens if your business does get considered a hobby? How do you keep the IRS from considering your business a hobby? And if you stick around, I will even show you a situation where you might actually want to be considered a hobby instead of a business. What's the main difference between the tax treatment for a business and for a hobby? The main difference is that on your business, you get to deduct more expenses. Before 2017, hobbies could actually deduct expenses, but you couldn't show a loss and there were certain expenses you couldn't even take. But after 2017, a hobby actually cannot deduct any expenses at all, but you still have to report the income as income and pay taxes on it. Whereas with a business, whatever expenses you have that are ordinary and necessary and follow all the rules, you can deduct on your business. You can even show a loss, and that loss may be able to offset your other income on your tax return, like W-2 income. So if you have, let's say, $50,000 of W-2 income and an active author business that lost $10,000, that $10,000 loss can offset that $50,000 of W-2 income, so where you're only paying taxes on $40,000 of income. But on the other hand, if the IRS were to consider your author business a hobby instead of a business, if that author business brought in, say, $10,000, even if you had, say, $20,000 of business expenses to where you actually did lose $10,000 on that activity, if the IRS considers it to be a hobby, you still have to pay taxes on that $10,000 of income, and you don't get to deduct the expenses. So instead of paying taxes on $40,000, like in our first example, you'll actually be paying taxes on $60,000. That's the $50,000 of W-2 income plus the income from the author stuff without being able to deduct any of those expenses. So that's the main reason why you don't want to be considered a hobby, because if you're a hobby, you can't deduct your expenses. But there may be a very specific situation where you could want to be considered a hobby, and I'll show you that at the end. But how do you keep the IRS from calling you a hobby instead of a business? To prove that your business is a business and not a hobby, you have to show the IRS that you had the intent to make a profit, even if you didn't make a profit. And one of the ways that the IRS will presume that you did have the intent to make a profit is if you had a profit in 3 out of the last 5 years that they're looking at. That's where you'll hear some people say like, oh, I can only show a loss for 2 or 3 years and then I have to show a gain in my business. I never like that line of thinking because it sounds a whole lot like tax fraud. What it sounds like to me is that you're taking expenses that you shouldn't be getting, and then every few years you're just not taking those expenses. Or like you're legitimately losing money on your business every single year, and some years you just choose not to deduct certain things. Anytime you file a tax return without the right information on it, even if it causes you to pay more taxes, it's tax fraud. The IRS wants you to file accurate tax returns. And if you really are losing money every single year for 5 years, I'm more concerned about that than I am about hobby rules. So don't manipulate your numbers just to avoid hobby rules or to avoid the IRS looking at you. Report the real things and let's focus on actually growing your business. But back to the hobby stuff. So how else can we show that we had the intent to make a profit with the IRS, even if we didn't make a profit? They're going to look at, did you do things that businesses do that hobbies typically don't do? So some of those things would include, if you have an LLC, usually if you're just doing a hobby, you don't go through the trouble of going to the Secretary of State and signing up and getting an LLC. Do you have bookkeeping and good records? Most people don't do that for hobbies, but this is a big one. If you have QuickBooks or even an Excel sheet and you're tracking all your transactions, you're reconciling your bank accounts, you're doing things that businesses do to keep track of things, and it shows that you're actually making decisions that could earn a profit, then that helps to show that you had the intent to make a profit. Do you have a separate business bank account? Usually if you have a hobby, you don't worry about doing that. It's another really good reason why it's important to have a separate business bank account from your personal account. Now, what if you're doing all of these things, but you're still losing money every year? Now, let's say the IRS comes in and they say, hey, we think you may be a hobby. You've been losing money every single year, and this is maybe a business that could lend itself to being a hobby instead of a business. And let's say that you show them all of these things that show you have the separate business bank account, you are keeping QuickBooks, you're keeping records, you're keeping receipts, you got the LLC, you're doing all these things that otherwise would show that they had intent to make a profit. Does that mean you're out of the woods and things are free and clear? Well, it may mean that the IRS won't consider you to be a hobby, but what they will do is they're going to look at all of those expenses and they're going to say, if these were really reasonable and ordinary and necessary expenses, why didn't you make a profit? They're going to look at your documentation to prove that every single one of your expenses did have a business purpose. And just remember that the onus is on you to prove to the IRS that there's a business purpose behind an expense. The IRS doesn't have the burden of proof to prove that it was personal. They only have to prove that you can't prove it was business. Okay, so now we know why you wouldn't want to be considered a hobby and we know how to get out of being considered a hobby. But what if you want to be considered a hobby, and when would you want to be considered a hobby? So, if you are doing something truly for fun, you do not intend to make this a business, you do not intend to earn a profit, and your expenses are minimal. You're not spending money on contractors. You're not doing cover designs. You're doing that yourself. You're not paying for editing. You really just want to put a book out and see what happens with it, but you have no intentions whatsoever of actually being a business. One of the weird benefits of being considered a hobby is that that income that you get from that hobby activity is not subject to self-employment tax. And self-employment tax is that extra 15% that you pay on top of your regular tax rate on your business income. But because your hobby is specifically not a business, you don't pay self-employment tax on that. But you also don't get to deduct any of the expenses. So first, don't try and make a legitimate business into a hobby just to avoid self-employment tax maybe in a year that you didn't have a lot of expenses. This isn't something that you can jump back and forth in between, and the IRS is going to look really suspiciously at something that started out as a hobby and then later became a business. This only is going to apply. This truly is just a hobby for you. And if you pass that intent test, then the next thing is to make sure that maybe you actually don't want this to be a business because you don't have a lot of expenses and you actually save more from not having to pay self-employment tax than you do from being able to deduct the little bit of expenses that you might have. So again, don't manipulate your numbers. Don't lie in your taxes just to maybe avoid some red flags or make things look better in your mind to the IRS. Instead, report what actually happened, keep documentation for everything, and make sure that the expenses that you're deducting are actually business related. If you have specific questions or you want to know something about taxes or how it works, let me know in the comments. You can also join our newsletter. I'll put a link there where we send out tips. And we also have an author community where you can talk to other authors about how they're doing things to grow their author businesses. Check all those things out, and I will see you next time.